A half-sob, half-laugh rose from Denver Bull Randleman's throat as he lay in a muddy ditch outside a Dutch village in the autumn of 1944. He was alone, wounded, and hunted by German patrols sweeping the area. One misstep in a chaotic firefight had cost him contact with his company. It might have cost him his life too, if it weren't for his unbreakable determination to survive. On that desperate night, as a cold rain mixed with the fresh blood trickling from a gash in his shoulder, Randleman tested the absolute limits of human resolve. He had always been a tall, powerful man, hence the nickname Bull, but alone in that damp Dutch field, raw strength meant little. It was his quietly stubborn will, the grit he'd learned from a humble upbringing, that kept him pressing forward. And it's that same resolute spirit that would eventually mark him as one of Easy Company's most respected paratroopers. Randleman came into the world on November 20th, 1920, in Rector, Arkansas. This rural corner of the United States was still grappling with the Great Depression when he was just a boy. Families worked sunrise to sunset to pull food from the land, making ends meet with whatever they had. In the Randleman household, money was tight, but discipline and community values ran deep. His father was a proud, hard-working man who taught Denver from an early age that you stuck by your friends. You showed up when people needed you, and you never dodged a day's labor. Growing up, Denver developed a knack for mechanical tasks, fixing a broken wagon wheel, tending to farm equipment, even tinkering with battered cars that occasionally passed through the dusty roads of his town. Neighbors described him as quiet but kind, always quick to lend a hand if the next farm over needed help rounding up cattle. In those Depression-era years, young Denver also discovered an intense love of sports, particularly baseball. The combination of manual labor and athletics built him into an imposing figure, yet his personality leaned more toward gentle humor than any sort of bragging. Classmates remember him as a good listener. He had a habit of nodding politely, the corners of his mouth lifting in a calm half-smile whenever he found something worth smiling about. That calm demeanor rarely broke, even in heated moments on the baseball field, suggesting that he had the kind of nerves that would serve him well in a bigger, far more dangerous stage later in life. Like most children of that era, Denver's schooling was basic, but he did well enough to graduate from high school with decent marks. College was never really on the table, not financially at least, so he took up hard labor jobs in the region, supporting his family and dreaming of a broader world beyond the farmland. This was the late 1930s and early 1940s, and war clouds in Europe and Asia were darkening by the day. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Denver felt the shock waves just like every American. Yet it wasn't immediate patriotism or a lust for battle that guided him toward enlistment. It was more a sense of obligation. The country needed men, strong men, and Randleman, always loyal to the people around him, answered the call. He soon found himself at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, as part of an all-new experiment in warfare, the creation of elite airborne units who would be delivered behind enemy lines by parachute. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, particularly E Company, later legendary as the Easy Company featured in Band of Brothers, sought volunteers who wouldn't balk at tough physical training and the near-constant danger of being dropped deep into enemy territory. Randleman's tall, muscular frame caught the eye of the training officers, but it was the steadiness in his eyes that made them think he'd do just fine. Camp Toccoa was notorious for the brutal runs up Currahee Mountain, the seemingly endless drills, and the tight camaraderie forged by it all. Denver's mild-mannered nature stood out. He wasn't the loud type, nor was he eager to mouth off to superiors. But when it came time to push harder, run faster, or climb longer than anyone else, he was right there, unflinching. The men of Easy Company bonded in those weeks of training like no ordinary group of soldiers could. They lived together, sweated together, cursed the heat together. Over endless nights in cramped tents, they swapped stories about hometowns and families. That's where Denver picked up the nickname Bull, a nod to his physical strength and the calm, unhurried way he moved. Like a powerful bull that's not easily provoked. Though not everyone in E Company came from farmland, they connected with Randleman's grounded perspective on life. Years later, many would say that if you needed a steady friend in a crisis, Bull Randleman was that man. By mid-1944, the Allies were preparing for one of the largest military operations in history, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Denver, along with his brothers in Easy Company, shipped out to England in preparation. At the time, so much was uncertain. No one knew how the landings would fare, if the paratroopers would be scattered to the wind, or how fiercely the German defenders would resist. Letters Randleman wrote home to a cousin reflected a quiet determination and just a hint of trepidation. I feel we've been trained for a good reason. We'll do our part. I just hope we all come back to see our folks again. That simple line showed the mix of acceptance and earnest hope that echoed in the hearts of every young paratrooper stationed in England. On the night of June 5th, 1944, hours before D-Day, Randleman and Easy Company boarded their aircraft. Nerves ran high as the planes droned across the English Channel. Through the open door, the night sky was lit by gunfire and searchlights below. The jump into Normandy was chaotic. Many paratroopers missed their drop zones, landing miles from where they were supposed to be. Randleman hit the ground heavily but managed to link up with a handful of fellow troopers. The confusion was total. German machine guns firing from hidden positions, farmland dotted with hedgerows that turned every field into a small fortress. But in the swirl of adrenaline, Randleman stuck to his training. He joined E Company in short order, helping secure roads and causeways to support the seaborne landings on Utah Beach. Though overshadowed by the massive amphibious landings, those early actions by the airborne troops were pivotal in disorienting the Germans and giving the Allies a foothold in Normandy. The fighting around Carentan soon followed. Carentan was key to connecting the Utah and Omaha beachheads, and German forces were determined to hold it. This was Randleman's first prolonged test under severe battlefield pressure. The days were blisteringly hot, the nights just as tense, and the men often had to rest among the ruins of bombed-out buildings. You could hear the constant rumble of artillery in the distance. The Germans put up a fierce resistance, and casualties were significant. During these engagements, Randleman's calm leadership shone through. Even as a lower-ranked NCO, he had a soothing effect on the younger troops. If someone was panicking, he'd gently remind them to slow down, reload carefully, and focus on the objective. It wasn't that he was fearless. He just kept his fear in check, never letting it cloud his decisions or his sense of duty. In the aftermath of the Normandy campaign, Easy Company was pulled back to England to recover, refit, and prepare for the next operations. Denver used the brief lull to write letters home. In one preserved note to his parents, he mentioned losing friends in battle, admitting how you try not to think about it too much because once you start, you can't stop. He also confided in them that he prayed every day, even if silently, for the well-being of his comrades. His mother's return letters, brimming with hope and reminders to keep faith, were cherished possessions. He was known to reread them in quiet corners, sometimes passing them around to buddies who missed the taste of home. Then came Operation Market Garden in September 1944, an ambitious plan to secure several major bridges in the Netherlands and punch a direct route into the heart of Germany. The men of the 101st Airborne were tasked with capturing and holding vital bridges around Eindhoven, Veghel, and Sun. It started well enough. Randleman landed safely, and the Dutch locals greeted the paratroopers with cheers and flowers. But the deeper they pushed, the more ferocious the German resistance became. Tanks, artillery, hidden snipers, everything the enemy could throw at them was thrown. It was here, near the little Dutch town of Noonen, that Randleman found himself in the dire situation that would define his legend. While on patrol, Easy Company came under sudden heavy fire from German armored vehicles and infantry. Forced to retreat hastily, the unit got scattered. In the chaos, a piece of shrapnel cut across Randleman's shoulder. Blood soaked his uniform. Disoriented, he fell behind as the rest of his squad pulled back. Before he knew it, Denver was alone, pinned down in enemy territory. Most men in such a predicament might have tried to surrender or slip away under the cover of darkness, but Randleman refused to give in. Throughout the night, he crawled through mud and hedgerows, ignoring the stinging pain in his shoulder. At one point, he holed up in a dilapidated barn, rifle in hand, ready to take on any German who might wander in. By early morning, the rain was relentless, and a thick mist blanketed the fields. Summoning every bit of determination, Randleman waited for a moment when he figured the enemy would be least alert, maybe during a shift change or a lull. That was when he made his dash, weaving through farmland and crossing a narrow field. He was close enough to hear German voices searching for stray paratroopers, but he pushed on. By the time he finally stumbled back into Easy Company lines, caked in mud, face pale, and uniform shredded, his fellow soldiers almost didn't recognize him. Word of his survival spread quickly, and Bull Randleman earned a new layer of respect for his unyielding resolve. In the months that followed, the Allies advanced toward the German border, but progress slowed dramatically. The harsh winter of 1944 to 1945 brought on the Battle of the Bulge. This was Nazi Germany's last major counteroffensive, and it struck the thinly held Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. Randleman and Easy Company soon found themselves in Bastogne, Belgium, surrounded and outnumbered, under near constant artillery barrage. They dug foxholes in frozen ground, endured sub-zero temperatures with minimal supplies, and stubbornly held their positions despite repeated German assaults. Randleman's calm leadership became a morale anchor. When other men felt despair creep in, numb fingers on a rifle trigger, meager rations, and no winter clothing, he offered reassuring words. If someone needed extra gloves or a scarf, he'd find a way to get it to them, even if it meant giving up his own. In a few accounts, soldiers mentioned seeing Randleman bandaging a buddy's wounded leg by lamplight, teeth clenched from the cold but refusing to complain. The siege lifted eventually, but not before the men of the 101st Airborne had etched their courage into history. Wartime letters show that Denver wrestled internally with what he'd seen and done. Though he was proud to be a paratrooper, there were nights when the ghosts of the battlefield haunted him. Once, he confided in a friend through a quiet conversation around a makeshift campfire that he wondered if he'd remain the same man after the war. That fear that the violence and trauma would alter him forever was common among veterans, but not often spoken aloud. Even so, Randleman carried on, aided by the camaraderie of men like Carwood Lipton, Joseph Toy, and others who were equally determined to see the war through. By mid-1945, with Germany collapsing, Randleman and his unit entered Bavaria, where they would eventually help in securing the famous Eagle's Nest, one of Hitler's mountaintop retreats. The end of the war in Europe soon followed. For Randleman, it was a bittersweet victory. He had survived multiple campaigns. He cheated death in a Dutch field, weathered the bitter cold in Bastogne, and come out the other side with only a few scars to show for it. Yet he also carried the weight of lost friends, men who had jumped from the same planes but never made it home. That knowledge tempered any feeling of triumph. Returning stateside in 1945, Denver discovered that slipping back into civilian life was more complicated than he imagined. He briefly considered a career in law enforcement or continuing in the military, but ultimately decided to return to Arkansas and marry. He reconnected with a longtime acquaintance, Gladys, who had been a steadfast supporter while he was overseas, sending him small care packages and warm notes. Their wedding was a modest affair, a simple church service followed by a gathering of family and close friends, many of whom listened intently to Denver's stories of Europe, though he rarely volunteered the most harrowing details. The newlyweds settled down in a small home outside his old hometown. Denver took a job at a local factory, using his mechanical skills. It was steady work, which he hoped would offer the stable life he'd dreamed about during the war. But the haunting memories of battle have a way of intruding into even the calmest of settings. Late at night, Gladys would find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. Sometimes he'd describe a dream in which the thunder of artillery shook him awake, a nightmare so vivid he felt the ground tremble. There were stretches of normalcy, weekends fishing, Sunday picnics, an occasional baseball game with local friends. Yet Denver carried invisible burdens. A letter from a fellow veteran who had also been in easy company once thanked him for always having my back. Reading it brought Denver to tears, something that startled Gladys, who had rarely seen him show vulnerability so openly. Over time, their marriage faced the predictable challenges of readjusting to civilian life, but also the deeper, more painful challenges many veterans endured. Some nights Denver was restless, short-tempered over small issues. He never lashed out violently, but the tension was clear. It took patience and love from both partners to navigate this lingering trauma. For a while, they considered moving away from Arkansas, but the roots ran deep there. They had children, 2 boys, and Denver poured his energy into being the father he wished he'd had more time with growing up. The same unwavering dedication he showed to Easy Company now manifested in coaching Little League Baseball or teaching his sons the basics of carpentry in the family garage. As the 1950s and 1960s rolled along, the world changed rapidly. Yet for the most part, Randleman's life in Arkansas remained steady. He rarely spoke of his war service in public unless someone specifically asked. He valued humility and believed in letting the past remain in the past, focusing on providing for his family. Eventually, though, historical interest in the 101st Airborne soared. Books were written, documentaries produced, and the world came to know about Easy Company. Stephen E. Ambrose's Band of Brothers, published in 1992, spotlighted these paratroopers, and a subsequent HBO miniseries in 2001 brought Randleman and his comrades into living rooms around the globe. Suddenly, people recognized him at veterans events. They'd read or watched dramatized accounts of his nighttime escape and survival in the Dutch countryside, and they wanted to hear it from the man himself. Denver found all the attention odd at first. He'd never considered himself a hero, just a soldier who did his duty and tried his best not to let his friends down. Yet he recognized the broader value. Maybe these stories could keep the memory of fallen comrades alive and remind younger generations about the reality of war. Gradually, he opened up, giving interviews, attending reunions. He was reunited with men he hadn't seen since the war, men who had also carried their own scars, both visible and invisible. Those reunions were emotional, a swirl of memories, laughter, tears, and heartfelt embraces. Denver's sons, now grown, said it was the first time they truly grasped the scale of what their father had experienced. Inevitably, the growing fame around Band of Brothers also brought controversies. Historians debated the accuracy of certain scenes, whether the show over-dramatized events or glossed over the complexities of strategy and command decisions. Some critics argued that focusing so much on easy company risked overshadowing the contributions of countless other units. Randleman listened to these debates politely, sometimes acknowledging that the show took liberties, but he was quick to emphasize that it captured the Brotherhood fairly, and if anything, tamed down the raw terror of actual combat. He'd remind critics that no show or book could fully convey the smells, the tension, the confusion that men felt in the midst of gunfire and artillery shells. In private letters, he'd tell acquaintances that he considered it a blessing that his old comrades were receiving long overdue recognition, even if the finer details weren't always perfect. Another point of contention occasionally surfaced among war historians: the question of whether the Allied paratrooper operations, particularly Market Garden, were misguided or poorly planned. After all, that operation failed to achieve its lofty goals, leading to significant casualties. Some suggested that the paratroopers were sacrificed for an overly ambitious strategy. Did men like Randleman resent that? He rarely engaged with such speculation. From his perspective, the job was to do what was asked of him and watch out for his fellow troopers. "We did what we had to do," he'd say. "History can sort out the rest." Yet there was no denying that the heartbreak of Market Garden lingered. He'd lost close friends there, and the memory of being pinned down in that Dutch field was a constant reminder of how swiftly war can turn. Despite those controversies, the overarching importance of Randleman's service, like that of so many World War II veterans, cannot be overstated. He was part of an airborne force that revolutionized modern warfare, proving that vertical envelopment could tip the scales if executed correctly. This opened up new strategic possibilities for later conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. But more than the military tactics, it's the personal stories of men like Denver Bull Randleman that keep the history of the Second World War profoundly relevant. Their experiences illuminate the human costs of war, the strain on families, the deep bond among soldiers, and the emotional aftermath that can last a lifetime. For anyone looking at modern society with its debates and divisions, Randleman's story offers a lesson in unity, loyalty, and sacrifice. Even though the war ended decades ago, the moral and emotional weight that paratroopers like him carried is still resonate today. People confront conflict in different forms, maybe not a battlefield in a foreign country, but hardships in everyday life. Randleman's example shows us that perseverance and concern for our fellow human beings can be a guiding light in dark times. That's why his story matters. It reminds us that behind the big strategies and speeches, real individuals bear the consequences. His experiences speak to the essence of leadership under pressure, of quietly standing your ground when everything around you is falling apart. As Denver aged, he stayed active in his community. Friends recall him helping neighbors fix roofs after storms and volunteering at local drives to support wounded veterans returning from more recent conflicts. He never wanted to draw a direct parallel between his war and theirs. Every war is different. But he understood the emotional scars that any conflict could leave behind. When Vietnam veterans came home to a divided public, he took it personally. He knew how crucial it was for soldiers to feel recognized and supported regardless of the politics. In fact, he once accompanied a group of younger veterans to a public forum. There he spoke gently but firmly about the importance of separating the warriors from the war, of honoring those who risk their lives in uniform. Randleman's own family grew, with grandchildren eventually bouncing on his knee. They saw only the friendly old man who liked to carve wooden figurines in his workshop, sometimes humming a country tune under his breath. Rarely did they see the haunted expression that would flicker across his face if a documentary about World War II came on TV. Yet if they asked him about those days, he'd share at least a few details. He believed in honesty and wanted them to know that freedom often came at a heavy price. He showed them his old uniform and jump wings, explaining with pride what the eagle insignia of the 101st symbolized. Occasionally, an old buddy from Easy Company would call, and they'd chat for an hour or two about the other men, who was still around, who had passed on, who needed help. Through those conversations, the family glimpsed the enduring bond that war had forged among those men. Eventually, age caught up to him, as it does to us all. Health issues arose, some linked to injuries from the war, some just the burden of years. Despite the aches and pains, Randleman remained humble. He never saw himself as some grand figure in history, but he did appreciate the chance to reconnect with fellow veterans at reunions and see younger generations express curiosity and respect. He understood on a deep level that these acts of remembrance carried forward the legacy of everyone who fought, not just the well-known characters from the pages of a book or frames of a miniseries. In the twilight of his life, Randleman attended a large World War II memorial event. Surrounded by crowds, he found himself standing next to a teenage boy who recognized him from a documentary. The boy, eyes wide with admiration, asked, "Were you scared when you were alone that night in Holland?" Randleman paused, the question clearly hitting him straight in the heart. He answered simply, "Scared out of my mind, son, but I had to keep going." The moment perfectly encapsulated the essence of Denver Bull Randleman. He was just a man, a strong, resolute man, who, in the midst of the worst circumstances imaginable, forced himself to face his fears so that he could return to his friends. That humility is why his memory endures. It's not just about heroic battles or cunning maneuvers on a map. It's about an ordinary American farm boy who found himself in extraordinary situations and rose to meet them, guided by loyalty to his fellow soldiers. This spirit of duty, tempered by empathy, resonates to this day. Historians might debate the intricacies of Operation Market Garden or question whether certain elements of Band of Brothers are dramatized. But no one questions the authenticity of Randleman's bravery or the depth of his devotion to his comrades. Long after the gunfire fell silent, the legacy of that lone night behind enemy lines remained with Randleman, a personal testament to what a determined spirit can endure. It reminds us that the measure of a person's character often emerges in the loneliest, darkest hours, when no one else is there to see how you behave. For Randleman, the only audience was the night sky above, and the unwavering thought of returning to the men who needed him. In the end, the lessons drawn from his life are many. Even amidst horrific violence, a quiet, steadfast heart can shine through. Even amidst global conflict, a sense of personal duty can overpower the fear of death. Even amidst personal tragedy and trauma, you can come home, fall in love, build a family, and find a place in your community. And even amidst the swirl of controversies or debates over historical events, the truth of human courage endures in stories like his. As we remember Denver Bull Randleman, we remember not just a paratrooper from Arkansas, but a symbol of what good can remain when the storms of war have passed. His life invites us to reflect on our own capacity for resilience, to honor those bonds of friendship that carry us through the worst of times, and to recognize that behind every heroic tale stands a real person heart beating with the same hopes and fears that we all share. There's something profoundly comforting in that realization, and it's the kind of comfort that can bridge generations, reminding us that the quiet hero next door might just be the one whose story we most need to hear.